And there is our trigger guard installed. So the next thing let's do is let's go ahead and put in the actual trigger and the hammer. So that we can see this a little better, I put this on a shop towel. You have your trigger pin, disconnector spring, your disconnector, and then your trigger spring. So the trigger spring goes on a certain way. So if you look at it here, maybe I'll move it up a little closer so you can just see it a little better. It has this flat section here, then it kind of circles around and comes up and it lifts up almost like little runners on a sled. If you can see how that goes. And that goes on the trigger. So with that flat part of the spring facing up, it goes on and rests in here with the round parts going over these parts here. So again, we'll take that like that, and then you just want to, it's hard to do it on the camera, but you just flip it over like that, and then we'll take that part and we'll flip it up over like that, and that, when this is pressed down, that's what gives us some tension, some spring tension. On the inside, you'll see that little hole down in there, and that is what your disconnector spring sits in. It's housed in there, and it is conical. So it's narrower at one end and wider at the bottom, and the wider end goes at the bottom. So what we'll do is, again, we've got our hole here, and sometimes these are a little, you kind of got to wiggle them and get them in. I'll probably have to do it off camera because I'm not going to be able to sort of do it like this and be able to see what I'm doing. But basically, you make sure that the wider end goes in and rests in that indentation. So I'm going to try and wiggle it down in there. There we go. And it should, with both springs in, should look a little bit like that. Once it's in the receiver, the disconnector will sit like that, and then if you can see the holes line up, and we'll be able to have that in the receiver. So let's do that next. So what we'll do is we'll drop our trigger down in there, and then we're going to take the disconnect, put that in there, and then we're going to have to sort of push down on stuff, and I'll take the pin and I'll push it in once I get everything lined up. So let me get a different angle here real quick. So one thing that you can do that will help you to get things lined up is you can use a punch, and you can take your trigger and without having the disconnector in and kind of push it down, and then you'll be able to see from the top. And of course I can see from the top, but you can't. And I'll take our disconnector and try and drop it down in there, and then we'll go across. So now I have the punch that's going to hold all that stuff in place for me. Except I don't have that through there. So now what I'll do is I'll take the disconnector and I'll drop it down in there, and kind of fiddle it around until I get those holes to line up. And once I get the holes to line up, I'll go ahead and push the punch all the way through. So that what that will allow me to do is I'll come back this way with the pin, and let me get a little better angle. So now that we've got the punch hole and everything in place, we'll take our trigger pivot pin and we'll try and get this thing through here. Sometimes they can be a little fiddly as they want to go through all the stuff. And sometimes you may need to give them a little bit of a tap. If you do end up tapping them, don't slam them real hard. Just go ahead and give them a push, and then what you want them again is to be equal distant on each side. And the only things that are holding these pins in are the spring pressure. So we've got our pin on this side and our pin on this side, and then our trigger here. So let's go ahead and do the hammer next. All right, so what we have is our hammer spring, and the hammer pivot pin. If you'll look inside here, let's see if we can zoom in a bit. You'll see that there's a wire, and there's kind of on this bottom part here. And on your pin, you have two grooves, and that middle grooves will interface with that wire that's down there. So your spring only goes on one way. So if you'll notice how the spring is wound with the outside legs hanging down. You don't want those legs to, if you were holding it, you don't want the legs to be to your right, you want them to be to your left. So they're proud to your left. And then what you do is, much like in the trigger assembly, you kind of get this over here. It's going to be kind of a bear to do it, but what you'll do is you'll rotate this stuff over here, and then you'll get this one and you'll rotate this on there to where it hangs down. So let me see if I can kind of wrestle around this thing on the camera. So what I want to do is come in from this side, and then some people get confused and they think it maybe goes like this, but again, if you were to try and put pressure on it, it wouldn't do that. So again, what we're seeing is this flat part of the spring here goes up here, and then as it comes and winds around, it winds around and goes off. So again, our springs are sort of proud to what would be, if we're holding it in this direction, what would be our left. And so your spring pressure when you put it in is going to be like that. So here's another little thing. Remember, we have that wire that's inside here, and with our pin, it has a groove here and a groove here. And so what we don't want to do is put the pin in this way first, so that we have two grooves, because if you do that, you have to get this groove onto that wire and then push it through. So if that makes sense, you want to do it right here so that it just slides in smooth, and it will hit, once it hits that wire down in there, it will stop it. That way you don't have to go past this one and then to get to that one, if that makes sense. So again, what we're going to do is we will use a punch to help guide our way through, and we'll drop this down in, and this is our hole here. Our springs go inside the receiver and around the pin, and let me get you, see if we can do a higher. So again, we've got our spring legs here, and it's going to go down and around on the sides of our trigger springs. So what we want to do is get that, you see, and push that in, and we're going to bend this up and kind of push this back and down at the same time, and we want to get these holes back down here and lined up. And you're fighting that spring pressure, which is kind of hard to do on the camera here, but let's see if I can get that in. All right, so we've got that in, and much like before, we're going to take our pin and we're going to sort of ride that in. All right, so that was a bit of a bear. So we had our hammer trigger pin here, and I was able to get that in, with the punch to get it all lined up. But sometimes what happens is when you get that thing in, it kind of wants to twist a little bit at an angle. So it kind of wants to go like that, and then your hole on this side here, sometimes it doesn't want to line up. So you really kind of have to get down there and sort of go kind of a little bit more, kind of face to face with the hole, and make sure that this is kind of twisted the right way and all that other stuff. So that's what I had to do. But generally, even with that, even if that's the most difficult time that you have with it, it's not that big a deal. So the next thing that let's put in is, let's go ahead and put in the safety selector. All right, so we've got our trigger. You see how the back of the trigger moves around in there, and you'll notice, and if it's your very first time doing it, you'll notice you're like, well, wait a minute, that's kind of blocking that hole. I need that to put my safety through. You have to remember that you need to have the hammer engaged, and what that's going to do is it will sort of rotate your trigger forward, which is going to move that end of the trigger is going to go down into the receiver. So watch if I can get the angle right. When I push it back, see if you can get it where you can see, as it engages on the disconnector, it goes back and out of the way. And so now you can go ahead and put your safety in. All right, so what we have here is our safety selector. It will go in here. Most kits that you get only come with one side. They don't come with what they call an ambi or ambidextrous safety, meaning that you won't have a lever on the right side of the receiver. It'll only be on the left side. In our case, we happen to have one that is going to be on both sides. So we'll have one on the left, and we'll also have one on the right. We've got our detent and our spring here, And what we'll need to do, in my particular case, is I'll need to undo this, undo the bolts here, and then I'll be able to put that in. And we'll also show you how it goes in. The detent goes in through here, and it corresponds with a hole here that is in the pistol grip. So your spring goes in like that, your detent goes in here, and then that pistol grip goes on like that, and that's where your spring pressure comes from. So the pistol grip is shoved up on here basically like that, and your detent rides in that hole and rides on the spring, and then that's where you get the pressure from. So let's go ahead and get that apart, and then we'll get that thing set in there, and then we'll be able to do a safety test. So I've pushed this through. Sometimes what you need to do, just because everything is kind of tight, is you've got to maybe give it a little bit of a tap once you see that it's lined up, which is what I had to do in my case. So we've got safe and then fire as it moves, and once I get the other side screwed on, I'll show you how that works. And if you had, let's say if you had a safety that only had the one side, this is all you would have. You would have safe and fire. So what we'll do on this side is we'll come in, and this has little, can you see those? You've got little grooves here and then little detents here, and they just line up. So again, you can't really get them on wrong. And what I will go back and do, I'm not going to do it right this second, but what I'll go back and do is do a little bit of Loctite on there. So what we want to do now is put our detent in. Actually, I suppose what we could do, I'll put my thumb here. So we've got it on fire. We can pull the trigger, it will fire. If we rotate it down to safe, nothing. Fire. And then if we were going to do a reset, and it catches. So what we'll do is we'll put our detent down in here. Hope if you can see. And we'll do that, and I probably, you know what I should do? Let me show you something here real quick before I forget. So this particular grip, which is by BCM, I believe, and I can't remember what mod this is, but they have a thing where it gives you more of like a little finger groove. I don't particularly care for that, so I will just put this in, which gives you this kind of a smooth trigger grip here, and it just pushes in like that, so you don't have any kind of protrusions or anything like that for you. So let's do a quick test fit, and let's see how well this is going to want to slide in there. These can be kind of notoriously tight. One thing I forgot to tell you real quick is the way that the pistol grip attaches is you have a hole in here that goes through the pistol grip like that, and then you've got a threaded hole here on the receiver, and then your bolt will go in through like that. When you put this in here and you're going to put this on the receiver, you just drop your spring in like that, and your detent goes in with the pointed end. So our artillery shell with the pointed end, that goes in because that's going to ride in those channels. And then what you do, and to make it to where I can see it a little better, you basically just kind of get this thing and you wiggle it on there. And like I said, these can be rather tight sometimes, but you want to make sure that that spring is going into there, because that's what's going to give you pressure. And then you just kind of wiggle that in, and also make sure that it doesn't get folded over or kinked. So you just be careful with it. Generally, I'm trying to do it where you guys can see if I can do it across the camera. So that's pretty much it. And then what we'll do next is we'll take our screw, or our bolt, I should say, and we'll pop that on there. And I don't know if you'll be able to see down in there. And then we'll make sure to get that started. And it's a lot of threads that's going in there, so just keep on going. In fact, I won't make you sit through this. I'll cut you back on once I get that thing done. But, well, there, you can see that a little better. All right, we have our safety installed on the left side and on the right. You'll notice a couple of differences about the lever. This one is scalloped, and that is so when you have the gun in the fire position, that this part of the safety lever normally would kind of ride up against your finger, and so they kind of scalloped it out to where if you're having an ambi safety, it doesn't kind of gouge into your finger all the time. Another kind of oddball thing about this is not a true like 90-degree safety. A lot of times you'd have a safety that would just go straight up and down. This one you can see as a little bit of an angle. So normally that little arrow on the safety selector would be more toward the middle, would be more toward like straight up and down like that. So this isn't a true 90-degree safety. I can't remember if it's like a 45 or a 60 or something like that. Anyway, it's a little bit shorter throw. Another odd thing about how the AR-15 is set up is if the hammer is up, you can't put the safety on. It won't go down. It needs to sort of be in the back position, and then it will go on safe. So that's it for the safety. And again, if we were going to imagine where that was, we've got our spring that basically sits up here, and then our detent is sitting right up in here. So again, that spring is right here, right about in there, probably. All right, well, what is the next thing we're going to put in? Why don't we go ahead and put in the pivot pin and the takedown pin. All right, installing the pivot pin can give you kind of a lot of fits. So the way that it works is the pivot pin kind of rides in these two channels, and then down in this channel you have your spring, and the detent sort of rests right up there. So when the pin is in, so you've got your spring in here, basically sits in like that, then you've got the detent on top of that, and that pin with spring tension, you can see it sort of pushes on there, will ride in this channel, and then falls down into the hole here. And sometimes these aren't the smoothest, and they can be a little stiff when you first put them in. But again, much like the safety selector, the more you use it, the more you take the pin in and out, those surfaces will kind of lap together a little bit and get smoother and smoother. One of the tricks to this thing is that you have to put this in under pressure. So you put your spring in, and the spring sits there, and then you take your detent, and you have to push that thing down enough to be able to get this pin in there. And a lot of guys run into some frustrations in that they'll go to push it down and it slips off, and then this little thing shoots out and they are never to be found again on the garage floor. So one of the tricks is that you can take a razor blade or something that's like a real thin piece of metal, and then you'll press it down and then you shove the pin in. So what I'm going to do is take you over to the vise because I'm going to use the vise block that's over at the bench, because it will let gravity be my friend. I'll be able to put it in and it will just sit up there like that for me. So let me cut you off and I'll show you what we're going to do here in just a second. All right, I'm hoping that that will focus. And what we're going to do, we're going to take our spring and we're going to drop it down in there. And then we are going to need to take our detent and we're going to put it right there. And then we're going to take a razor blade here that's relatively thin and we're going to push that down and hold it like that. And so I don't know if you can tell, but that should give us enough room to push this in. And we want to push it in with this facing down. And then once you get it in like that, you can just let it up and it's fine. And then that goes in. Right there, you can see the detent. All right, everybody, we are coming in on the home stretch. The last parts you see here all kind of, I guess, integrate in. They all kind of tie into one another. So it's not like we can just put in our takedown pin, because without putting the receiver extension tube and without having the castle nut and the end plate, it's not going to be able to be held in. It would just fall out of the hole in the back. Sort of the same thing with the buffer retainer and the buffer retainer spring. The buffer retainer has this raised portion and then has a little ledge, and on the way that it stays inside the receiver is that lip comes over, and as this is screwed in, it rests in here. And then this protrusion here goes up against the buffer like that, and that's what holds it in. The buffer spring and the buffer are housed inside the receiver extension tube, and those are again held in under spring pressure by the retainer. So a lot of this stuff, what we need to do is just sort of assemble it kind of all at once. The first step, I guess, in that would be, and before the retainer plate, what that does is it holds in the spring and the detent. And the detent and the spring pressure are what holds in your takedown. Yeah. So this has this little raised lip here, and what that does is it fits into the back. It keys into here so that it won't let it move around from shocks and things like that. These areas here are just wings to do a sling clip. This area here is for a quick detach on a sling release. So you could have an end plate that wouldn't have these, and this would be solid. They will be keyed on the bottom of the receiver extension tube. You see this little slot that's milled in here. The way that this goes is you have your castle nut, and on the castle nut you're going to have a larger opening, and then you're going to have these either smaller indentations here, and those are for staking. But generally what you'll do is you'll run the castle nut all the way down. You'll take your end plate and you'll pop that on here, and you want that raised part to be able to go up into here. And so what we'll do is we'll carefully start to screw that in, and when we start to get, I don't know if you guys are really getting the light here or not. Let me see if I can maybe angle it more that way. Will that work? I think that works a little better. So as we screw this in, we see that the edge of the receiver tube is starting to overlap that hole. And if we went forward, it would pretty much cover it up. Now, our buffer retainer, that is where that goes. So what we do is we take our spring, drop him in there, and then we take the retainer, and then as we screw this in, we push this down with our thumb, and we want it to where it just kind of comes in over there, just like that. And that is about as far as I'm going to be able to get that in. And then what we also want to do, the receiver extension tube, you want to make sure that this is pretty much as straight up as down as you can get. So that when whatever you put on the end of this, if you put a stock on it or whatever you're going to put on there, that is straight. You don't want it canted off one direction or the other. So that's how that's held in place. But before we actually do that and screw that in, we'll actually kind of do this a little bit later. But I did want to show you how that went on. We still need to put our pin and our detent and our spring in there. And what we have to do is we'll back this off. And then we will drop in our pin. We'll drop in our detent, and we'll drop in our spring. And then what we want to do is we're going to want to screw this forward again. And as this plate comes forward, and as we will have to time it to where the spring gets pushed in, but it doesn't get scrunched over. So we'll go ahead and do that now. And I'm going to kind of move off to the other side here. So we're doing a couple of different things at once. So what we're going to do, this is hard to do around the camera. I haven't done this on camera before. So I'm having to kind of mush this thing around here a little bit. Well, see, that got messed up. All right, so after a lot of struggling, I finally was able to get this in, to get everything kind of timed up. Part of the problem is this tube is just maybe a tiny bit too short to be back where I would actually like it to be. And having it come forward, what I may end up having to do is maybe pull this out and just file just a tiny, tiny bit off the end of that tube. I'm kind of a little bit too tired to do it right now. Also, another thing that I need to do, which I'm probably going to do anyway, because I think there is the tube, the edge of the tube, the lip of the tube is putting too much pressure on that buffer retainer, and I think it's kind of it's kind of pushing it forward a little bit more than it needs to be. So I haven't torqued this down. Normally what you'll do is you'll torque this down between like 35 and 40, 45 is what I've always done on my builds, and I've never had a problem with it. And then these little divots right here, what you do is you take a punch once you get it torqued down and you stake it. And what that means is that you drive metal from the end plate, you push that metal over into there where you can. And that keeps it, along with getting it torqued down to the proper specs, that pushing some of that metal in there keeps your castle nut from walking off. The staking isn't strong enough to where if you're on there with a wrench and you twist it off with a castle nut wrench, it'll just push that metal right over. But it is strong enough to keep the castle nut from backing off. So that, I guess I will show you one last thing on how the spring and the buffer go in. So those go in, and then they're held inside the tube, and you see that the retainer sort of does its job that way. Well, that is it as far as putting this thing together. As far as maybe for showing an example of how you'd want to put a AR-15 lower together, hopefully it answered some of your questions. Hopefully I didn't leave you with more questions than you have than you got answers. But hopefully I did able to show you kind of how to put this thing together. And it's relatively simple. If I wasn't doing this on video, I could probably put it together in 15 minutes, maybe 20, barring some little struggles here and there. So because I am planning on using this as a 9mm, let's go ahead and put our stern defense magwell adapter in there. All right, let's go ahead and we'll get that thing popped in real quick. So let's do our bullet button. So we got there, that's good and solid on that. But anyway, let's give it a test run. So it goes in. Let's see if it drops free. Sure does. All right, hope you enjoyed it. Take it easy. I'll talk to you next time.